"I have to go back," she repeated. "I have to do it." "Over my dead body, you little fool. You're going home," he told her, "but with me." Her face was half hidden in the collar of his coat, and warmth had come back inside her. Aggressively, and yet with a certain gentleness, he placed her inside his Jaguar. He stroked his fingers down her cheek, and she could see his eyes smouldering in the soft light from above the car doors. Her breath caught in her throat, and she wanted that look to stay in his eyes, never to change. That quote is from Love is the Honey by Violet Winspear, and introduces us nicely to the subject of this talk. My name is Vic Pickup, and I'm a postgraduate researcher in English literature at the University of Reading. I'm currently in my 4th year working in the Mills Boon archives. I'm also a poet, and my PhD has a creative component, which will include a poetry collection inspired by my work in the archives. But more about that later. Before we begin, I wanted to address the pink floral elephant in the room and air some popular preconceptions about Mills and Boon. Having asked the audience of this lecture about their impressions of the brand, common themes which arose were that they were romance books, cheap paperbacks, granny's favourites came up a lot, and that they were silly, cliched and formulaic. My personal favourite was the idea that they were crack for middle-aged women. Indeed, there are lots of conflicted, perhaps ill-founded ideas about Mills and Boon and the book's reputation. There are different views of quality and cultural worth, whether they're harmless or unhealthy, feminist or not. But the contents of the books are not the subject of this talk. Instead, the authors are our focus, from post-war up through the 70s. In this presentation, we'll be looking at the producers over the content, the writers over the writing. We'll consider the author's achievements, the escapism this created for readers, and the kinds of escape realised for the authors themselves. Now, my PhD is focused specifically upon these writers' uses of apology within their correspondence, which tells us a lot about society's conventions at the time, amongst other things. But here, I want to take a step back and focus on the overriding importance of these authors' lives through their romance writing and discuss what influence they had. Perhaps even change the way you think about your granny's choice of reading materials. So what does Mills and Boon have to do with Reading? It might come as a surprise to you to know that the Mills and Boon archive forms part of the special collections at the Museum of English Rural Life, also known as MERL. The archive contains over 70,000 letters exchanged between 100 women authors and their editor, Alan Boon, in the mid-20th century, as well as 4,500 first edition copies held off-site. To add a bit of context, Mills and Boon was founded in 1908 by Gerald Mills and Charles Boon. The company started as a general publisher, concentrating more upon romance as demand increased after the First World War. Sadly, Mills died in 1928, and following a scramble for the money to buy his shares, Boon continued to grow the company. Mills and Boon's popularity is reflected in that when the Ministry of Supply refused to give them their paper allocation in World War II, the Publishers Association protested on their behalf, stating that the books were vital to boost morale, with specific mention to women in factories. Following Charles' death in 1943 and the end of the war, sons Alan, John and Carol returned from service to take the reins. Here we see Alan, who dealt with editorial and corresponded with the authors, and John, managing director, in their London office. Under their management, Mills and Boon continued to grow in popularity. One library recorded a single Mills Boon book was lent out 740 times in 1 year, which is unsurprising given that Mills Boon estimated that a mean of 50 women would read every book they published. When the lending libraries closed, mass market paperbacks made it still possible for working class women to access Mills Boon, as they were cheap to buy, shared within social circles, families and communities. Each copy passed over fences or slipped between handbags many times over, as described in this excerpt from a survey commissioned to define readership. After I have read the books, my mother reads them, followed in turn by my aunt, who returns them to me. They're passed on to a neighbour who is a pensioner and a widow. She in turn reads them, and they are then taken to a home for the elderly and infirm ladies. I feel you will appreciate that your books bring considerable pleasure to many people, particularly in view of the fact that the ladies at the home, so I am told, look forward to the lady taking them into them. Mills Boon was bought by Canadian publisher Harlequin in 1972, which is now owned by HarperCollins. The brand is still growing in popularity. Mills Boon releases 100 books each month, many of which are ebooks, and it remains one of the UK's top romance publishers, with a particularly strong market in India. Whilst I can't report on today's figures, prior to the digital revolution, in 1998, Mills Boon sold 200 million paperback novels in 100 overseas markets, translated into 24 different languages. It must be noted, however, that into the 80s and post-Harlequin's acquisition, the books are very different, certainly more erotic, whereas lovemaking back in the 50s meant giving in to the urge for some heavy petting. So there's no disputing the enduring popularity of Mills Boon. A large part of this is down to its brand of escapist literature, as highlighted in the marketing ephemera shown here. So, looking more closely at this idea of escapism for the readers of Mills Boon, what did readers want to escape from? Aside from women in factories were mothers, carers, housewives, spinsters, and working class women. These images shown are rather manicured. The reality would have been rather more grimy, I suspect. The survey we looked at would indicate that some readers wished for escapism from the perceived invisibility of older age. Mills Boon allowed readers to feel, to want, to dream, regardless of health, age, or mobility. Women also craved an escape from domesticity, perhaps from living in East London slums, or from a life of servitude to husband and family. Following the Second World War, where women took on the roles of the working man, the country withdrew heavily subsidised childcare, and the marriage bar remained an impediment for women seeking employment. Having contributed to the war effort and been given a chance to learn and employ new skills, many found themselves unable to work and forced to return to domestic life. In some cases, a life of increasing discontent. Escapism was needed from hard times, from war, depression, rationing and poverty. Mills Boon was a ticket to a holiday in the head, available to anyone, regardless of demographic. Mills Boon delivered a guaranteed happy ending, encouraged and indulged readers' fantasies, provided a hard-earned and sacred moment for themselves. So what's special about how Mills Boon books did this specifically? Early on, Mills Boon adopted core editorial principles of Lubbock's Law and the Alpha Man. The former takes its name from Percy Lubbock's The Craft of Fiction, requires a story to be told from a heroine's point of view. The hero, the Alpha Man, symbolised here by the dashing Cary Grant, must conform to type as a strong, dominant figure in need of emotional rescue. Drawing on Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, The idea of sticking to a female protagonist's feelings enables better reader identification, facilitating greater investment with the character and immersion in the story. The authors create the same inclusive experience in each book they write. And while Mills Boon is criticised for adhering to this set formula, it was this which delivered the escapism that made their books so popular. A predictable happy ending in a bombed-out world. Who wrote these books? There is very little research which recognises the authors who prolifically produced the books, which arguably contributed to societal change in the status of women within our culture. We're looking at authors post-war up until the 70s, when the company was bought by Harlequin. Certainly, at the beginning of this period, writing was an unusual occupation for women, particularly for women of humble origin. There are 10 authors here of about 20 who have photographs and can be identified. The dates you see are the times that they wrote for Mills Boon, where this information is available. Virginia Woolf famously said, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." What if she has neither space, nor time, nor finance to support a writing career? And what difference can she make with what she produces? Woolf also said, "I can sit alone by an open window for hours if I like, and hear only bird song and the rustle of leaves. The trees are pure gold and orange." Which sounds rather lovely, doesn't it? But the typical Mills Boon author didn't have such luxury. We're looking at mothers, carers, housewives, spinsters, farmers' wives, nurses, teachers, who wrote and produced thousands of books around all this other labour and consumed by millions of women. Aside from these 10, here is a representation of each woman who has a file in the archive but does not have a photo existing that I have seen in the archive, in books or online. So how did these unknown women break into publishing? Mills Boon had an open door policy and invited unsolicited manuscripts from anybody. So they created a collective of authors from an array of different backgrounds. Author profiles included the working class, untravelled, single, young, elderly. Nearly all the women in the archive had lived through the Second World War. They earned well from their writing for Mills Boon. The most prolific earned enough to buy their own houses at a time when women were not allowed bank accounts, let alone mortgages. An example of the kind of earnings we're talking about is in 1949, prominent author Sarah Seal earned £2,370 from book royalties, serial rights and a film option. Today that would translate as £105,000. By 1952, so that's just 3 years later, her annual pay had risen to an equivalent of £137,500. Dr. Joseph McAleer, author of Passion's Fortune, a fantastic book about Mills Boon's history, states that by 1969, Mills Boon were publishing 144 hardback titles and 72 paperbacks per year. English language sales totalled 15 million, of which 10 million were considered exports or foreign sales. So knowing all of this, should we see our authors as akin to modern day influencers? Their content shared and liked, mass market, accessible, transcending class. Who would have thought that a spinster, a housewife, could be empowered to commit her fantasies to ink and paper and make her fortune? Not that it was easy. Being a Mills Boon author required commitment, intelligence and skill. The ability to write convincingly about what they didn't know. Many thousands of manuscripts submitted each year were rejected. I arrive at this point as a writer, mother, avid romance reader and designated toilet cleaner in my own house. To a very, very small degree, I walk in these women's shoes. My laptop lives on the kitchen counter in sight of piles of washing up and pans boiling over. My ideas come to me when I'm unblocking a sink or on the school run. I also know what it takes to be published. Regardless of context and ability, it requires ambition, tenacity, a thick skin. It also fulfills the urge to be heard amidst a life prioritising caregiving and domestic maintenance. Now that we've outlined the importance of the brand and the women behind the books, and introduced the idea of escapism for readers, let's take a closer look at how this experience of writing for Mills and Boon transformed life for the authors, particularly those from working class backgrounds. Escapism wasn't just for the readers. Authors frequently expressed how much they enjoyed writing them. Summed up by Essie Summers, who was a minister's wife, who said, "I'd curl up and die if I couldn't write." Success as a Mills and Boon author also meant physical escape through a refreshing empowerment. In a woman's normal life, there were not many opportunities to make it. For these women, regardless of background, their high-value product was manufactured entirely from their own imagination and observation. Most had little or no spare money, no time, no luxury, no specialist equipment, and no connections. Success was 100% powered by their own agency and drive that they achieved this elevation in status and standard of living. Often without free or subsidised childcare or sacrificing another duty. They just wrote on top of the usual demands on their time. Any other career would have relied upon needing physical support from another in order to make money or to attend a workplace. Mills and Boon offered flexible hours, working from home, which was a huge enabler. These authors' earnings offered physical escape through economic independence and home ownership. I'm going to highlight two women whose lives were transformed. Firstly, it's Isabel Chase, who wrote 35 novels for Mills and Boon. She explains her story in an article published by the Kent Advertiser. For women, it's a form of escapism, she says, a type of vicarious daydream. It all started, she recalls, when I lived with my mother on the Romney Marshes at Newchurch. To earn a living, we kept hens, but I decided I'd rather write books. So she visited her local library and found the most popular books were romances, and that the publishers of the type that she liked best were Mills and Boon. She calls her writing quite lucrative. Now she lives with her mother in one of the nicest parts of Folkestone. We found we were spending too much time lagging pipes in winter on the Romney Marshes, she says. Nowadays, she writes as many as 4 books a year, but still finds time for hobbies. The next author I want to look at is Violet Winspear, who was one of the most prominent Mills and Boon authors of the time. She wrote 70 novels between 1961 and 1987. Having left school early following her father's death, Violet had 24 different factory jobs and saw such success she was able to eventually write full-time. She was a spinster and a carer for her elderly mother. She never had a serious romantic relationship and had little experience of the world outside the East End. Her imagination was nourished by library books. Her earnings enabled her to transcend her class. She moved from a council estate in Hackney and bought a house in Leigh-on-Sea. Authors escaped their surroundings and benefited from a wider social circle. Ordinary women formed a community. Some authors were amongst those who founded the Romantic Novelists Association. They had a supportive publishing environment. Mills and Boon was a progressive company. John Boon's son Humphrey told me the ethos was work hard, play hard. There were frequent afterworks drinks, celebrations with champagne in abundance in the office. There was no hierarchy in the business. It was run with compassion. If you needed time off, if you were having trouble, there was no issue. People liked working for John and Alan. They offered raises without being asked for them, and they did not make demands of their authors. If you were lucky enough to be in the Mills Boon Authors Club, you would frequently be invited to London for some serious wining and dining. Alan would regularly take his authors for champagne dinners at the Savoy or up the BT Tower for an orbit. Many authors wrote proudly of the certificate they had received. Indeed, one author recounts that Mills Boon had a permanent table, the only one with a rose on it. There were also Christmassy phone calls, flowers if you were unwell, grapes if you were in hospital, advances if you were having financial difficulties. And in Violet's case, when she was in great need of surgery but deprioritised as a woman not of child-rearing age, Alan promptly arranged for her treatment and visited her frequently during her recovery. This kind of support was not unique. That said, the juggle was real. There were limitations for the average woman author. Some things could not be escaped. Domesticity. So many authors struggled with exhaustion and conflicts, with jobs like cleaning, entertaining, looking after ill relatives, fixing broken pipes, helping husbands with spontaneous construction projects whilst heavily pregnant. I kid you not. There was also the issue of having other work. Amanda Doyle, who I referred to by her pseudonym, and I'm afraid I have no image of her, was a cattle breeder, and she wrote in secret, fearing her reputation amongst the farming community. Author Jean Blythe exchanged many panic-stricken letters with Alan when the South African Nursing Association didn't approve of her writing and told her it must stop if she was to carry on working as a nurse. There was also the judgment that these women faced. Authors might have felt discouraged by treatment from the press, who often focused upon the personal, marital status, looks, age, with just a glance of what they had achieved. Sadly, this is still quite often the case. An example of this is Gloria Bevan, who was the author of 25 novels. Again, I have no image of her. But there is a newspaper clipping in the archive which is derogatory of her appearance and open about underestimating her, describing her as a fairly ordinary on-a-hunger housewife who loves scribbling. Mrs. Bevan admits to being completely unliterary, a pleasant, modest, unassuming woman. She probably typifies the unremarkable housewife who waits beside you at the supermarket cash desk. That said, what they did achieve, despite these obstacles, not only meant escape for them, but through their authorship, the most successful writers used their work to enable escape for others. There was those that they cared for, such as Violet and Isabel's case, and there were many authors who paid for their children's education, travel opportunities. And there were also extraordinary cases where these women widened the benefits of their work to others through philanthropy and solidarity. Elma Buller, no traceable image, I'm afraid, whose letter on the 13th of September 1977 declared that all funds from her book, Back of Beyond, would go towards the restoration of St Mary's Church in her village. Despite her earnings being ample, there were 3 payments referenced at this time equivalent to £10,000, £20,000 and a further £9,000 soon after. Boon was still required to send a written assurance to the builders, stating that Buller was able to pay for the renovations. She wrote, "It's amazing how little faith the average man has in the continued earning power of a romance writer." There are even examples of authors enabling actual physical escape from harm. So distressed by reports of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, Vivian Mann donated all royalties from one of her earliest books, Serenade on a Spanish Guitar, to the Red Cross Hungarian Relief. This brings me to the remarkable story of Ida Cook and her sister Louise. Leaving school with minimal qualifications, they obtained work as typists in the civil service, earning £2 a week. There's a whole other story I don't have time to go into, which led to them to learn of the plight of the Jews in Germany prior to World War II. Ida wrote prolifically, over 120 books in her career. She lived in poverty and used all her earnings to sponsor Jews coming to the UK, personally smuggling high-value items such as fur and jewels brazenly through customs whilst playing the crazed spinster act and convincing high-profile associates to donate to their cause. She bought a safe house in Dolphin Square, London, as a base for the refugees. When war was announced, Ida stayed in London and worked as a night watcher in Bermondsey Shelter, and when her own home was bombed, she also sought refuge in her flat. Thanks to the money earned from Mills Boon and her sheer courage and determination, Ida and her sister saved 29 lives. Their efforts were recognised when they were awarded the status of righteous among the nations, along with figures like Oskar Schindler. My research and the ideas expressed in this talk start a conversation. This is one seam of exploration from the university archives, and there is so much more to be found. I'd encourage anyone to have a look online at what's available to view and request a seat in the reading room to explore the wealth of historical documents and ephemera held there. Without this demographic of women writing at this time, particularly those from a working class background, we have a narrow range of voices that we are permitted to hear, ultimately impoverishing our cultural landscape. Mills and Boon's story and the women who created their product bring to the fore a fascinating insight into what the female populace wanted or were allowed to want within a patriarchal society, and how this changed through the larger part of the 20th century. These are stories we can't ignore, especially when these archived letters form a piece in the puzzle of women's history. Looking at Mills and Boon with a wider lens, the brand name is synonymous with derision, mockery, and much parodied. In doing so, we are laughing at the women who lived for these books and relied upon them. Yet another example of how we are still diminishing them today. Aren't the wants and needs of millions of women of interest relevant to us, worthy of research? There's another conversation to be had about echoes between the past and the present. We would hope that background is no longer an obstacle to those forging writing careers. However, it's still the case that working class women do not manage to penetrate the creative industries, with evidence of structural underrepresentation in publishing and other artistic sectors. One of the most famous cases where lack of time and money presented an obstacle is J.K. Rowling, who lived in squalor as a single parent when she wrote Harry Potter. Whatever your feelings towards her in light of recent controversy, this achievement was remarkable. All this underlines what a beacon Mills and Boon was, why it's important to change the stereotype of Mills and Boon and look to the brand before it was purchased by Harlequin as a progressive example of a business founded on fairness, created for women, by women, with two men enabling their success at a time when this was necessary. We should know these women's names and give them a place in history, aside from the household names of the men who founded the company and in John's case were awarded an OBE. Working with archives has been an adventure and a privilege, but there are challenges when it comes to research, such as the issue of copyrights and estates. The question of who owns the letter or image that's found itself in the Mills and Boon archive. And what happens when you want to tell a story but have no consent to share it? There's also the issue of ethics. It's unlikely these women would have expected us to be sitting here now analysing their stories, or in my case, their correspondence. Would they be flattered or appalled? Then we have the problem of the gaps and the missing. Instead of seeing this as a problem, I've chosen to lean into it. My PhD is practice-based, so to navigate a lot of the issues I've just outlined, I'll be exploring the unsaid through poetry, merging my own interpretation with other sources and off-record interviews with romance authors of the era into a collection which tells the stories without legal or ethical infringement. And I want to tell the story of these women who farmed chickens, contributed to the war effort, worked in factories, walked barefoot to avoid the cost of new shoes, would scrub and polish and care, and then, in a state of exhaustion, sit at their typewriters and create a shared dream. 1,000 love stories which formed a community between women. An opportunity for escapism, escape, the chance to dream. I'll finish with a poem. Squalor. There is no room. How domesticity robs creativity. How the rumination spoils us. The daily insignificance of a task, the jobs nobody notices unless left undone. What could have been accomplished? Shame on me, on my kin, for not being taught properly or too slovenly to keep a home, putting the family at risk of lice, diphtheria, or worse, when we live in squalor. So I keep up appearances, scrub the step in full view, arrange wildflowers on the table, waft hot apple pie at the open window as passers-by marvel at what I have accomplished. But there are days when I want to leave the sludge in the sink, the sweat-stained shirt in the basket, droplets of piss on the seat, and all the other dirt to make its nest when we live in squalor. I am remembering these women, the ones who chose the typewriter over the washing up, who binned the stockings and went bare-legged, damned if they'd be caught darning when books might write themselves. Imagine what could be accomplished when we live in squalor. Thank you.